My name is Alice, and this is the story of my marriage, a union that has shown me that there is nothing better than exploring your darkest desires with the person you love. Our love story is far from a fairy tale, but it has been real, visceral, and passionate, and all thanks to our game. My husband, Michael, is the most incredible person I have ever met. He's the kind of man you can't miss when he crosses your path. He always has a witty comment on the tip of his tongue and is a money magnet. He has had a successful career as a plastic surgeon and is considered one of the best doctors in the country. For me, Michael is everything that is good in life, 100 out of 10. At your side, I have known love in ways I never imagined. I have found a home, my dream place. But like any marriage, things begin to cool down a little as the years go by, and time does not prepare us to deal with and accept this situation. In the past, our encounters were frequent, crazy, and passionate. There was no way we could be apart for more than 2 days. But over the years, their intensity began to wane, and neither of them knew how to deal with it. Or that's what I thought after 6 months of evasions and excuses that kept us away from what we once were. One night, when we were getting ready to sleep, Michael revealed to me a secret that would change everything. "I want to make a confession to you, Alice. You know that I don't hide anything from you, and I know that you will never judge me," he said, as he stood on his side to look at me face to face. "It's just that sometimes when I need to release quickly, like a moment ago in the shower, I imagine that you are with someone else," he whispered, "right here in our bed." Michael paused. After seeing my reaction, he continued, "I watch them from the chair while I free myself at the same time that you and that stranger do. I have had other scenarios, our trip to the mountains or that time at your parents' house, but this is different. The idea feels so good, so stimulating." Michael sounded excited, but after finishing speaking, silence took over the room without anyone being able to break it. At that moment, I felt so surprised that I didn't know what to say, but after a few minutes of silence, I dared to formulate what my mind was thinking. "Would you like to try it?" "We could," he responded immediately, with enthusiasm as he hugged me from behind. His arms held me with the same love I was used to. "It's a crazy idea, of course, and you and I are no longer young people who can do crazy things without thinking about anything else. I don't know how we could do it, but if you're willing, we could try. Have you thought about the possibility that this might not work? What doesn't make me comfortable or what bothers you?" I asked seriously. Although Michael's idea was a tempting scenario, the stakes were high. "I've thought about it, and I swear I won't bother," Michael responded confidently. "You know me, I'm not jealous, but I understand what you mean. If we do it, we must do it with rules. I've seen couples who plan these encounters do so on dating apps, but the decision is yours. At the end of the day, all I'll do is watch." Michael knew that I was not a prude. I never was, and there was a time when I wasn't afraid to experiment. We have been together for 15 years, and in all that time we had never fallen into monotony. There was always something new to try, and that kept us united and satisfied. But I was aware that we had already discovered everything that two people could experience. The world continued to offer an infinite number of possibilities that we did not know about. "What do you propose?" I finally asked. I was determined to get out of my comfort zone. He is not one of those people who acts on impulsiveness or on a whim, nor for a simple fantasy. He knew my limits, and he knew that sooner or later I would give in to temptation. "We can try it once, and if you don't like it, we'll forget about it," Michael responded as he took my hand. He smiled at me like he always did, giving me support and encouragement. Then he said, "We can also do something that you want to try." "Okay, let's do it, but I'll choose the subject and the place, okay?" I decreed firmly. If we were going to go into deep water, I at least wanted to have a lifeguard. And that's how we began to plan what would be one of the most pleasant experiences I had ever experienced in my life. The day came like any other. We got up, had breakfast, and got ready to go out. It was Saturday, and we agreed to meet the guy at the hotel entrance. Michael had been in charge of making all the preparations, such as paying for the room and buying a bottle of champagne to get us in the mood. For that day, I dressed discreetly, but I carried with me a bag where I had kept the clothes I had intended for this occasion. I bought a cute and flirty red lace outfit that I knew Michael would love. So, even if the meeting went badly, she wanted Michael to notice that she was willing to do anything. The subject, whom I will call Robert to maintain his anonymity, had arrived 10 minutes before the agreed time. As soon as we entered the hotel lobby, I noticed Michael squeezing my hand. We stopped for a moment, and he took the opportunity to whisper in my ear that no matter what happened next, he loved me, and nothing I see will change that. His words gave me the courage I needed to continue and finally meet the special guest of our game. "Hello, I'm Robert. It's a pleasure to meet you in person," the guest introduced himself. He was a tall man, much younger than Michael. One of our rules was that we didn't want people who had any physical resemblance to him, so Robert was the best option. He had dark skin and good bearing. "A pleasure, Robert. I hope our evening is profitable," said Michael. Robert nodded with a smile and then looked at me. I noticed that his gaze seemed curious, and I imagined that he was wondering how a lady like me was going to do it. "Let's go up," Michael said, taking me by the hand. After Michael asked for the room key, we walked towards the elevator. When we reached the 8th floor, my hands began to sweat. Robert walked behind us as if he wanted to put distance. Next to me, Michael seemed relaxed and even excited. Suite 023 was chosen for that occasion. "It's luxurious," Robert commented when we entered. Michael closed the door and locked it. Hotels like this were not the first choice of a family or a group of friends. The comfortable and comforting environment they were looking for could be ruined by the passionate screams of other guests like us. This hotel was the love nest of many couples who wanted to enjoy an evening without self-consciousness. "Very well, is it okay if we have a drink?" "To warm up," Michael proposed. "Yes, of course, thank you. It would be good for me," Robert responded. Michael went to the bar to pour the champagne. "Well, we don't have glasses for the occasion, but these whiskey glasses will do," Michael commented gracefully. After saying cheers, in unison, Michael spoke up. "Well, Robert, you had told us that you read the rules that we gave you, but I would like to review them in the same way, okay?" Robert nodded. "You are not allowed to attack verbally or physically," Michael began to mention seriously. "You will not speak to me or look at me while you do it, and under no circumstances will you do anything that she does not want. Finally, when this is over, you will never contact us again. We don't exist, correct?" "Everything clear," he responded. From then on, everything felt like a movie. I changed in the bathroom, and when I came out, Robert had already done the same, so we could start. In one corner, Michael had sat in an individual armchair that had been rolled from the living room to the corner of the room. The whiskey glass was on the floor, completely empty. It seemed to me that, of all of them, the one who was smartest was Michael. I took a deep breath and walked towards Robert. At no time did I exchange glances with Michael, and I concentrated on the man who was within my reach. The chemistry that Robert and I had was instant, and I felt more confident when I noticed that my appearance was not indifferent to Robert. Michael wasn't the only man in that room, and knowing that I was desired despite my age made me feel brave. Michael had turned off the main light, leaving the lamps on the nightstands to be the only ones that illuminated the room. That made the atmosphere more provocative. In a short time, I discovered that the novelty of being with someone other than Michael excited me more than I thought. Robert was very enthusiastic and careful, and it didn't take him long to take control of the situation, just as Michael expected. For a while, I was so immersed in what we were doing that there was no room in my mind for my husband. Only when curiosity won, I took advantage of the fact that I was lying face down on the bed to look at Michael. What I saw surprised me. Robert and I weren't the only ones who were enjoying this game. In a corner of the room, in complete darkness, Michael surrendered to the fury of his own desire. The more intense my meeting with Robert became, the more Michael enjoyed it. There was something twisted in his gaze, but far from scaring me, he had me captivated. I have met many men throughout my life, but I had never been able to put Michael in the same category as the others. Michael was fire in everything he did, and he had always had a particular way of looking at me. Maybe it was the intensity of his gaze or Robert's dedication that led me to reach nirvana. The feeling of liberation had been so strong that tears flowed from my eyes without being able to stop them. Spasms ran through every inch of my body until my feet went numb. In front, Michael collapsed into the chair, with the evidence of his outburst spilling over his hand. "That was intense," Robert mentioned behind my back with obvious fatigue. For a few moments I had forgotten his presence, and when I heard it, I couldn't help but laugh. The laughter erupted with such abandon that soon Michael and Robert joined me, infected by the feeling of well-being and satisfaction that comes when reaching the top. Then we repeated it 2 more times. I don't know what kind of experiences couples have in these cases. I don't know if they follow a protocol or if they just let themselves go. But when it was all over, Michael returned to being that gentlemanly and diligent man he used to be in all aspects. The dark facet had completely disappeared. I continued to lie down, experiencing the last vestiges of my release. Next to me was Robert, dressing slowly. "All good?" Robert asked. At that moment, I assumed that his question was not directed at me, but at Michael. I couldn't help but laugh because I knew Michael had enjoyed it in a way that was hard to tell, but obviously our guest was trying to test the waters in case Michael decided at the last minute to give him what he deserved for having sex with his wife. "Everything is fine, Robert. I appreciate that you agreed to come," said Michael. Robert and I had hardly spoken when we got out of bed, but we had communicated in a magical way throughout the day. Before night fell upon us, Robert said goodbye with a mischievous smile, and the room was ours for the rest of the night. Michael ordered room service, and we spent the night remembering the past between laughter and stolen caresses. There was such a strong air of complicity that I couldn't help but blush every time he laughed. We were like 2 young people who were discovering love for the first time, free, without ties of any kind. "Did you like it?" Michael asked when we lay down on the floor of the balcony to take in the view of the city. "Yes, and you?" I replied. "Very much," Michael responded. The following month we did it again, with a different guest and location, pretending that we were not Alice and Michael, but 2 strangers who were united by passion, with the desire to the surface. The social prejudices that existed around this type of activities were present at all times, especially when it was time to start a new encounter, a new lover. Gambling had saved our marriage, but it had also freed us in ways I could never have imagined. When we were in the room, Michael and I stopped being husband and wife. There was no room there for anything but pleasure in the company of another face. The expectation of who would be next became an incentive that added to the experience. For Michael, seeing me with someone other than him was his way of healing, of letting out those demons that he feared so much. And, for me, it was the opportunity to explore an unknown but longed-for facet. In that room, with Michael's gaze fixed on me, I felt free, empowered, and admired. What one day started as a simple game soon became a constant in our relationship, and some games can be addictive. Would you dare to play? Thank you very much for listening to us, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.
I am a Colombian woman, 28 years old, married to my husband Jack. A few years ago, we moved to a comfortable apartment in New Chicago. My husband works on a construction site far from the city, so we go weeks without seeing each other, although we always try to stay in touch. We have been married for 2 years, and like any marriage, we have had our ups and downs. I once discovered that he had subscriptions to adult sites and recently found chats where he was flirting with a work colleague. We are trying to improve our relationship, and I am also in therapy for eating problems and depression, which undoubtedly affected our coexistence. Everything changed a month ago when I had an accident and fractured my right leg. I stopped working and we were forced to temporarily move to my in-laws' house because I needed help and my husband couldn't be with me due to his job. Since I arrived at my in-laws' house, I noticed a lot of tension in the air. They argued often, and that created a somewhat uncomfortable atmosphere. My husband had already told me that his dad had been a bit of a womanizer and a bit of a troublemaker in his youth, but that he had calmed down in recent years. Seeing him, a man of over 50 years old, strong and with an imposing presence, I was not surprised to learn that in his younger years he had been a Don Juan. When my husband returned to his job at the construction site, my father-in-law began to be more attentive to me. He came to my room a couple of times a day, worried about how I was feeling, knowing that I was having a hard time both physically and emotionally. At first, I didn't give much importance to his visits. After all, I figured he was lonely too. One particular day, I was very emotional and told him about my frustration over the accident and how I felt about losing my job. He looked at me with a face of concern and tenderness, told me that everything would be fine, hugged me, and in a gesture that surprised me, kissed my shoulder. Then he said goodbye. That gesture disconcerted me a little, but not having had a father figure, I interpreted it as something normal. I even liked it. But a few days ago, everything changed. He came into my room very early in the morning. I pretended to be asleep because I didn't feel like talking. However, he returned later when she was already awake. "Can I keep you company?" he asked me in a serious but gentle tone. I was surprised to see him so early, but I said yes. He sat next to my bed, and we started talking. The conversation flowed naturally, moving from everyday topics to more personal ones. At one point, we started sharing intimate experiences and talking about crazy things we'd like to do. That's when he started telling me his fantasies in my ear. Although there was no physical contact between us, the proximity and his words created an intense atmosphere. And then, in one gentle but firm movement, he hugged me. Suddenly, I found myself paralyzed, as if an electric shock had coursed through my body. I wanted to move, but something inside me kept me still, confused between fear and a strange sensation that I couldn't identify. On the one hand, I didn't want to confront the situation, but on the other hand, there was something about that moment that inexplicably attracted me. His words had ignited something in me that had been dormant for a long time, that uncertainty and excitement of the unknown. Then he looked me straight in the eyes with an intensity that unnerved me even more. With a soft smile, he leaned towards me. I felt completely vulnerable, even sitting on the bed. He began to caress my arm gently, a gesture that contrasted with the intensity of his gaze. I was wearing shorts to sleep, and although my mind screamed, my body did not respond, trapped in the moment. In one swift motion, he moved closer, his breath close to my skin. I felt his hand sliding gently up my arm, crawling every inch of my skin. He had never experienced anything like that. It was as if each touch revealed a new level of sensitivity in me. Then he moved away slightly and carefully pulled up my shorts, as if he were afraid to break a spell. He said goodbye with a kiss on the forehead, leaving me there, blushing and confused, trying to process what had just happened. My husband had always been more reserved in these matters, never daring to explore beyond the conventional, always concerned about what was right. In contrast, his father seemed to understand the secrets of desire in a deeper way. The experience had been overwhelming and left me wondering about things I didn't know. In the days that followed, every time my mother-in-law left the house to run errands, the air was filled with a palpable tension. It was crazy and I knew it, but something in me had awakened. One day while my mother-in-law was at the market, my father-in-law came into my room. "How are you today?" he asked me in that deep voice that was now so familiar to me. "Better," I responded with a small voice and my heart beating a mile an hour. "Do you need something? Any help?" His insinuating tone left no doubt as to what he meant. I couldn't believe the words that came out of my mouth. Maybe a little company. And so with those words, we took another step in our secret and dangerous game. It was crazy and I knew it. My mother-in-law and my husband trusted me, and I was betraying that trust in the worst way possible. But that was like an escape from my reality, a way to feel alive again, even if it was in such a twisted way. I remember one day in particular when my mother-in-law was out visiting a friend. "This is wrong," I said to my father-in-law, with a feeble attempt to resist the inevitable. "I know," he replied, "but I find it impossible to get away from you," and with those words any remaining resistance vanished. Our meetings became a dark secret, a series of moments full of passion and madness. I knew it was wrong, I knew I was playing with fire, but at that moment none of that seemed to matter. However, deep down, there was always that constant fear of being discovered. I knew that if my husband or mother-in-law found out what was going on, everything would fall apart. But in that state of madness and evil, that fear only added more excitement to our dangerous adventure. One day, While my father-in-law was busy, my mother-in-law sat next to me and looked at me with concern. "How's that leg going, dear? Are you feeling better?" he asked sweetly. "Yes, thank you," I replied, feeling deep guilt as I looked into her eyes. "Recovery is going well." She nodded and then in a softer tone said, "I want you to know that you are welcome here. Are you comfortable in the house? Is there anything you need?" I thanked her and assured her it was fine, but she continued, "And tell me, how do you get along with my husband? I know he can be a little intense at times, but deep down he's a good man. He even told me that he likes you very well and cares about you." His words took me by surprise. "Yes, we get along well. He's very kind and attentive, especially with my injury," I replied, trying to hide the sign of nervousness in my voice. She smiled satisfied. "I'm glad to hear that. He comes off a little serious sometimes, but he has a good heart. I just wanted to make sure everything was okay between you." The conversation continued for a while longer, talking about everyday things, but inside me the anxiety remained there. My mother-in-law's genuine concern contrasted sharply with the secret she kept. I felt trapped between gratitude towards her and the forbidden feelings that linked me to her husband. That night, while I was alone in my room, a blow of reality hit me hard. What was he doing? He was risking everything for a few moments of passion, but every time I thought about ending the whole attraction, something would drive me back into sin. And so the days continued, each one marked by the duality of my life in that house, between the affection and concern of my mother-in-law and the secret and forbidden meetings with my father-in-law. It was an unsustainable situation, and I knew that sooner or later something would have to change. One day everything changed. My mother-in-law had gone out as usual, but returned earlier than expected. I was in the living room, and my father-in-law, who thought we still had the house to ourselves, came into the room with a knowing smile and a particular gleam in his eye. He approached me in a slightly bolder manner than usual without realizing that his wife was about to walk through the door. Just then my mother-in-law entered the room. The expression on her face quickly changed from surprise to suspicion as she watched her husband jerk away from me. There was an awkward silence and I could feel my heart racing. "Is everything okay here?" she asked in a tone that was intended to be casual, but her questioning look at her husband said otherwise. "Yeah, sure," he replied, trying to sound nonchalant. "I was just wondering how you felt about your leg." She nodded, but something in her eyes let me know she wasn't completely convinced. From that day on, I noticed a change in his behavior. He began to stay at home more, watching us with a look that I interpreted as a mixture of doubt and sadness. One afternoon, while my father-in-law was in the garden, she sat next to me and looked me straight in the eyes. "My dear, there is something you should know about my husband," she began seriously. "Sometimes he gets carried away by impulses. It's not the first time I've suspected him, but I never thought that you..." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Understanding dawned on my face, and I knew she had connected the dots. "I'm sorry," was all I could say, my voice barely audible. Words seemed so insufficient for the magnitude of what he had done. She looked at me with a mix of disappointment and pity. "I don't want this to destroy our family," he finally said. "But I can't let this continue." She looked at me with her eyes reflecting many emotions. "You have to leave this house immediately," he said firmly. "I will protect my son from this humiliation and contempt. I will not tell him what has happened, but I cannot allow you to continue here." I felt my heart shrink. "I understand," I murmured, although each word was difficult. "I will make up an excuse about your leaving," she continued. "But I ask that you never look for my son again. What you have done has not only hurt me, but it has betrayed his trust and that of our family." I nodded, unable to find the words to express my regret and the guilt that consumed me. "I'm so sorry," was the only thing I managed to say, although I knew those words could never repair the damage caused. She stood up, her posture showing determination, but her eyes did not hide the pain. "You should gather your things and leave as soon as possible," he concluded before leaving the room, leaving me alone with the overwhelming weight of my actions. I gathered my things, each object a reminder of the life I was leaving behind and the catastrophic decisions I had made. I knew that, by leaving, I was closing a chapter of my life, but also beginning another full of uncertainty and regret. As I left the house, I took one last look, knowing that it was a final goodbye not only to a place, but to my husband and a part of my life that had ended abruptly. The future was uncertain, but I knew I had to face it, learning from my mistakes and trying to rebuild what was left of my life. A few months after I left, life had changed drastically. I learned that my husband had suffered greatly upon discovering my sudden absence. The story they told him was that I had left with a businessman I had met, attracted by his money and power. They said I had no respect, a story fabricated to hide the painful truth. Living with the weight of my actions and the lie that had been told was very hard. Every day, I faced the mirror and saw the reflection of someone who had made irreparable mistakes, someone who had broken the trust and love of the people I loved most. Guilt consumed me, and the pain of knowing that I had caused my husband so much suffering was a constant burden. I was assaulted by memories of the happy moments we shared, totally contrasting with my current reality. There wasn't a day that I didn't think about my ex-husband, wondering how he was doing and if he had managed to find any comfort or if he still felt the sharp pain of betrayal. I found myself living in a small apartment, far from everything I had known. Every day was a struggle to rebuild my life, to find some meaning in the midst of the chaos I had created. I was working a modest job, trying to keep myself busy so as not to drown in my thoughts. Regret accompanied me constantly. I knew there was no justification for my actions, that I had chosen a path that destroyed the trust and love I once believed in. I often wondered if I could ever forgive myself, if I could learn from my mistakes and be a better person. And that's how my story ends. A confession of infidelity that shames and blames me to hellish levels. But what do I have to assume? Now you can judge my facts in the comments. I hope there is someone who can at least minimally understand what happened. My marriage was not as perfect as it might seem. Anyway, thank you for listening to my story until the end. Please, I ask you like the video, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear new disturbing stories and secret confessions. Thank you so much.
My name is Catherine, and I am a married woman who has been tempted by a man. I want to clarify that I am not an ordinary woman who lets herself be carried away by the charms of a man, much less by a worker on my garden. But specimens like Robert, my gardener, are not seen every day. It all started at the beginning of the year. Robert had shown up on a Monday to be interviewed for the gardener position, thanks to the recommendation of our housewife, Mrs. Josephine. My husband had interviewed him for a few minutes, and after introducing him to the property, they agreed to carry out a trial period to evaluate if Robert adapted to the work style that the property required. We didn't usually rotate employees, since most had been working for us for years and many of them were already like family. However, circumstances aligned so that we needed one more gardener, one who could work day and night if necessary. That's when I learned of the existence of Robert, an enigmatic and hard-working person who seemed not to care about my husband's demands. The first time I saw him, he was on his back in front of the kitchen fireplace. He was stacking some logs on the ground and seemed very concentrated on his work. My husband and I hadn't had a chance to discuss the new planter, so at the time I saw it, I had no idea what it would look like. I only knew his name, Robert. "Hello," I said as I approached. The gardener turned around immediately while running his hands through his pants, cleaning them. "Hello, you must be Mrs. Catherine, right?" he asked. For a moment, my mind went blank. In my mind, I had the image of our gardener, Mr. Augustus, a chubby old man who could barely keep his balance when using the ladder. He was a nice and responsible guy, but he was no longer old enough to do heavy work on the garden. But in front of me, I had a tall, burly man with brown skin and dark hair. Unlike Mr. Augustus, Robert was the definition of youth. I estimated that he must be between 25 and 30 years old at the most, and later I verified it. Robert was just 27 years old and had been working as a gardener since he was a teenager. "Yes, my name is Catherine, and you must be Robert," I responded with a smile. The fascination I experienced at that moment made me break one of the rules that my husband had established for me when we got married and started living on this huge property. Do not engage in conversation with the employees. At that moment, I just wanted to get to know him more, so I banished my old habits and dared to be curious, to let this man tell me who he was. "What did you think of the property? Have you already taken a look at the garden?" I asked as I walked to the table and picked up an apple. Robert remained in the same place as if he didn't know what to do, continue with what he was doing before I entered the kitchen or continue answering my questions. Obviously, he opted for the latter. It's huge. Mr. Augustus showed me the garden first thing in the morning, although the boss told me to work mainly in the garden. I imagine it is Mr. Augustus's work, he explained. You could tell he was polite and modest. Oh yeah, Augustus has been here longer than me, and the orchard is his specialty, I responded. And after taking a bite of the apple and swallowing, I responded, I'm sure you'll do well. You have the makings of being good at everything you do. Robert just smiled, but I knew my comment had embarrassed him. I swear that at that moment I hadn't said it with bad intentions, but perhaps Robert caught what my body was trying to convey. Our conversation ended shortly after, but it was enlightening enough to get to know a little about the person behind the tough guy facade he always put on. Robert came from a humble family, and as the oldest brother of 5, he began helping his father in his work as a carpenter. He did not specify at what age he began working, but just looking at him was enough to estimate that he had taken his first steps into the real world when he was still a child. Hard work was written in the way he spoke, in the way the veins in his arms stood out, and the slight but noticeable wrinkles that formed on his forehead when he frowned. The circumstances he had experienced had turned him into a strong and confident man with the bearing of a puma. In retrospect, I now understand that the moment our eyes first met, I wanted him, but at that time I was immersed in my marital problems and in the constant demand of my husband's family to give him a child. My own personal frustrations wouldn't let me look beyond my bubble, at least not enough to notice that my body had wanted Robert from day one. Time passed, and Robert's work was well received by my husband. Robert was not charismatic, but his work and the way he moved around the house made him seem like a confident man, something that not only I noticed, but also the staff and my husband. Upon finding out that Robert also had experience in carpentry, Emmanuel, my husband, soon entrusted him with other tasks. And when I least imagined it, Robert's image began to blend with every space in the house, as if his presence was always needed, whether to treat a pest that threatened the harvest in the garden, to calibrate a door, or even to help, to the cook to carry the bags of flour. If I went out in the mornings to drink coffee on the porch, I knew that Robert would be watering the plants. I later discovered that if I sneaked into the backyard after dark, I might find Robert shirtless, hot after a long day of hard work. That was when the trial period arrived and Robert was hired permanently. To welcome him, Emmanuel ordered Mrs. Josephine to prepare food to celebrate. With hot food and liquor lightening the atmosphere, the celebration was held in the kitchen on the ground floor. The place was big, but with all the employees present, laughing and chatting, I felt trapped and hot. On the other end, Emmanuel kept yammering on about how important the job was and how glad he was to have someone like Robert on the property. At one point, after pouring himself a shot of tequila, he did the honors of toasting. Not before dedicating a few words of welcome from Robert. Well, Robert, I hope that from now on you see this property as your home, Emmanuel declared, as he put an arm around Robert's shoulders as a sign of sympathy. We will always welcome you here with open arms, son. Let's celebrate. With glasses in hand, we all toasted, infected by Emmanuel's joy. But for some reason, Robert didn't seem to share the emotion. It didn't take long for him to slip away from attention. The rest of the night he spent with Augustus, as if he were the only person he felt comfortable with. I won't lie to you, at that point sanity was fading from my mind. Desire was fueled with each interaction, even if it was insignificant and meant nothing. Every time I saw him from afar, whether working or walking around the ranch, it was as if he were showing off, or at least I thought so. Until everything happened. That morning, the crowing of the roosters had woken me up. The sun had not yet risen, but workers could already be heard talking and walking back and forth. Robert was one of them. At that point, my body was reacting to the sound of his voice. The day had passed in complete calm. I had answered some calls in the office, and then I had gone down to the dining room to eat in the company of Emmanuel, and after finishing, we had said goodbye as usual, with a closed-mouth kiss that expressed everything that had died between us. Then I returned to the office, and for the next few hours the routine kept me busy, longing for the end of the afternoon to take off the mask I had built up over the years. As the last rays of the sun faded from the sky, I closed the computer and ran to the balcony of my room. Robert always showed up at the same time every day, his button-down shirt covered in sweat and his boots full of dirt. But despite his deplorable state, he was still seductive. There was something in the way he walked, in the sweat that fell from his forehead or from his shirt rolled up to the elbows, that made him irresistible. There is no way to take your eyes off him. But that day there was something different, something that changed everything and caused everything to get out of control. From the window, hidden between the folds of the curtain, I saw how Robert went to one of the bushes and hid there. At that distance, I could see that he was taking off his shirt. Before undoing the last button, Robert stopped for a moment and looked around, making sure no one was nearby. And that's how he finished undressing completely. I have no words to describe what I felt when I saw him in that state of vulnerability. The surprise that he had removed his clothes to take an improvised bath with one of the hoses that was used to water the land left me paralyzed for several seconds. Soon the astonishment of her daring faded into the background when Robert turned around. The view of his body from the front was far better than anything he had imagined. Robert's virility was a declaration that life could be noble with some people, and they had provided him with everything that would drive any woman crazy. Of course, I was no exception. Frightened, I moved away from the window and ran to the bedroom. For hours, I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling as time passed. It was difficult for me to understand why I felt so upset. She didn't know if it was because she had seen him without clothes or because she had wanted him much more intensely than before. The image of Emmanuel came to my mind, of the man he had been in his youth, and no matter how much I tried to recreate his young figure and what he managed to generate in me at that time, nothing seemed to do justice to what I had seen in Robert. There was a big difference in both of them, and my body screamed to discover if Robert's magnetism was just as attractive in another area. The loneliness did not help to dispel my thoughts. Emmanuel's absence became more intense that night, and moved by desperation, I waited until the employees went to rest in their rooms to raid the bar and grab a special edition of Jose Cuervo. With bottle in hand, I left the house and walked until my feet got tired. For a moment I looked around, trying to understand where I was, but the liquor made me slow, and the darkness didn't help either. Fortunately, I didn't get lost that night because someone had seen me leaving the house and followed me. "I'm Mrs. Catherine. Are you okay?" At that moment, I didn't know who was talking to me. I was still staring at the starry sky, and the only thing keeping me sane was the weight of the bottle in my hand. A hand grabbed my wrist, and when I looked, it was Robert. My body reacted faster than my mind, and the next second I was kissing him. But that first contact didn't last long enough because Robert walked away from me right away. "What are you doing?" asked. Alcohol did not allow me to feel afraid or ashamed, so when I responded, it was not the same demure and submissive Catherine who always expected others to speak for her, but the woman seething with desire. "I want you, Robert. I've been doing it for so long that I can't take it anymore," I whispered, trying to shorten the distance he had imposed between the two of us. He remained silent, so I dropped the bottle. The sound of the liquid spreading over the ground didn't stop me, and I brought my hands to his forearms, squeezing them gently. If it's mutual, it's now or never. Robert looked at me for a few seconds without moving a muscle. Now I can remember that, during those seconds, my heart did not stop beating. During those moments, it seemed that time stopped, and everything went by with abandon once our lips touched for the second time. There I knew that I was not indifferent to Robert. On the grass, Robert and I got rid of the clothes, the titles that separated us, and any thoughts that prevented us from feeling and exploring pleasure in its rawest state. With the stars as the only witness of our meeting, we give ourselves without regard, without prejudice, It was just our bodies expressing what we longed for. During the time I was in the garden with my gardener, I understood that there were loves that come to destroy what we are not able to face. For a long time we were there, intertwined. There was a force that prevented us from separating, and the more I gave myself over to the pleasure, the more Robert gave me of himself, his body, his essence, his strength. He could be capable of everything at the same time, make you revive what you had already buried in your life, turn you back into a loved and desired woman. I don't remember what happened next. Do we say goodbye with a kiss like Emmanuel and I did every time we each went our separate ways? Had we agreed that it was a mistake motivated by alcohol and repressed desire? I didn't know. The next morning, the vestiges of what had happened on the lawn remained fresh in my mind, and my body kept reminding me with every inhalation and exhalation. The friction of the clothes on my skin reminded me of his own hands exploring, and the heat of the morning sun to the fire that his attentions had sparked inside me. That morning his memory was still alive, and when I passed him in the kitchen, his look made me understand that what had happened had not been due to alcohol, that when it was all over. There were no regrets or justifications. That he had not given in to his boss's command, that he had not felt obliged to make a lonely woman like me his out of pity. What his eyes screamed was that he had liked what had happened, and he wanted to repeat it. Sometimes one-time encounters mark you in inexplicable ways, and I was sure that the mark that Robert had left would not be easily erased from my skin. And now it's your turn. Do you think I managed to hide that secret from my husband? I know what I did was wrong, but sometimes you go with your instincts, and this was my case. If you want more similar confessions, subscribe to the channel and like the video. Thank you very much, and until next time.